Good morning and welcome into Community Conversations. I am your host and facilitator, Orlando Williams, Chief Executive and Equity Officer of Motus Recruiting and Staffing, Inc. I am pleased that we're able to partner with the Portland Trailblazers to bring you this meaningful discourse in an effort to move our region forward. And this morning, we are going to be discussing rebuilding the human connection. Certainly that's needed right now in our world and our communities. And I have the distinct honor and pleasure to have as my guest this morning the Honorable Justice Adrienne Nelson. Justice Nelson, how are you this morning?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I'm excited because we haven't gotten a chance to see each other, I think, since we had dinner. So it's been a little while, and I'm excited to talk to you this morning. I want to share with those who are on a little bit about your background. And of course, I will be introducing you to some, but reacquainting you to others, because you are so very active in the Oregon community that many know you and know your work, and if they don't, they've heard you speak before, so we know that everyone is in for a treat. But I want to give them a little background, a little history on you before we get started, and we'll have a little Q&A and just have a wonderful conversation this morning. So here we go. So Justice Nelson grew up in Arkansas and attended the University of Arkansas, where she graduated summa cum laude with a BA in Criminal Justice and English. She completed her JD degree at the University of Texas School of Law. Justice Nelson moved to Portland, Oregon in 1994, and where she started her work as an attorney in private practice in Portland and the Multnomah Defenders, Inc., a nonprofit public interest law firm. And then she also worked with Bennett, Hartman, Morris, and Kaplan, LLP, from 1994 to 2004. And also, Justice Nelson was a senior attorney in student legal and mediation services for Portland State University. Justice Nelson has been a member of the American Bar Association House of Delegates and the ABA Commission on Disability Rights. She is a past recipient of the Oregon Women's Lawyers Judge Mercedes Diaz Award. Justice Nelson has also received Oregon State Bar President's Public Service Award. She has also served as president of the Multnomah Bar Foundation and president of the Oregon State Bar Foundation as well. And of course, in 2018, Justice Nelson became the first African American to serve on the Oregon Supreme Court, or any kind of appellate court in Oregon, for that matter. And also in 2018, one of the items that I know Justice Nelson appreciates a great deal is that a naming committee for the North Clackamas School District has proposed to name its newest high school Adrienne C. Nelson High School in honor of her. That is an incredibly distinctive honor. I don't know how many people in present day that I get to talk to who have a high school named after them. So that is amazing. And in addition to all of those amazing things, and I could have gone on, but in addition to all of those amazing things, Judge Nelson is also very gracious in giving of her time and serves as a mentor. She's a trustee on several boards around the community, and actually was a trustee on the board for Self-Enhancement, Inc., a board that I currently serve on. So we have that in common as well. So just so many accolades, Justice Nelson, to name. What a wonderful contributor you are to Oregon. We are so lucky that you are here. Tell me, in addition to our conversation, I'd love to maybe talk a little bit about your background and what brought you to Oregon.
My mother was insistent that I live near her for her, but she also made sure that I could have a career in Oregon. So I met all of the Black judges at the time who were no longer with us. And I realized that Oregon would be a place that I could start my career. I didn't know if I would live here forever, but I was really excited about that possibility. And so I came and I stayed because I met people who were honest about where Oregon was in terms of addressing its history around race, where it was hoping to go, and bringing new people into the conversation.
That's wonderful, wonderful. And I think there was a time when Oregon also actually acknowledged some of its challenges in the past in Salem. And I think that was a meaningful moment for many Black Oregonians. And I think maybe that might have had an impact. And you were here or maybe even present at that event, if I'm not mistaken.
I was. So I was pretty new into living in Oregon, and I had begun to plant my roots, if you will. And so I was very interested in hearing the concept of the Day of Acknowledgement. I had much respect then and now for Senators Abel Gordley and Margaret Carter, who were the architects of this and got all of their respective legislators to sign on and participate in the Day of Acknowledgement. And I actually took off from work to go down to witness it, because coming from the Deep South, growing up in Arkansas, educated in Texas, traveling across this country, and actually being international in some ways in my travel, I had never seen a state do that. So I was really curious to see what was going to happen. So I drove down to Salem, and I was in the legislature when they did the Day of Acknowledgement. And then I subsequently participated in a couple of conversations, post dialogues about where do you go from here. But it was very, very interesting to see how much had been embedded systematically to disenfranchise large groups of people, and how it started with one group and then they added another and then they added another and then they did other things. And it took until 1999 to really scrub all of that language from our state constitution.
Wow, yeah.
And with the language being scrubbed did not mean that the systems ended or that the hearts and the minds changed. It meant that there was an acknowledgement of the words and that there was continuous work that needed to be done, and it continues to today.
That's phenomenal. And so in doing that, being relatively new to Oregon and not having seen a state take those types of steps, you mentioned that played a role in your desire to stay. And we see a lot of individuals come to Oregon but then depart. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing, what were those aspects of that really created that connection to Oregon that allowed you to decide to stay here and to keep your roots here?
You know, what happened was that I am a student of people. And so when I came to Oregon, I had visited, I would say every 3 to 6 months, because I was trying to keep my mother happy and let her see the development of her grandchild, her only grandchild at the time. So I would come and I would notice patterns of where people lived, how people seemed to move. And I was intrigued by it, but then it would be time for me to leave. So when I moved here in the summer of '94, and then I started working downtown in Portland later that same summer, I noticed that these patterns were actually consistently showing up. And so I began to ask people, why was it so? And they would go, oh, you noticed that? And I was like, yes, I noticed that. So often there would be a sheepish look and say, well, this is what it was. Or some people was like, I really don't know, but it's been like that a long time. And I was hoping other people would notice. But you might want to go to the Historical Society. So I went to the Oregon Historical Society and I picked up Peculiar Paradise, which talks about the history of Black people in Oregon. Mm-hmm. And I was very curious because I saw the splintering. And then I would also have conversations with people about how it wasn't safe to go certain areas into parts of the state. And I was like, I don't understand that. I grew up in the South where we had freedom fighters and all kinds of stuff, and people addressed it. But I didn't question it in the sense that I didn't believe it was real. I wanted to know what happened that instilled that deep emotional reaction that was being passed down generationally. But with the honesty, also said, we also know we need people like you and other people to help us create the state that we all hope it can be. And that was also inviting to me, because I truly believe if you are not participating in some way, you are complicit in what goes wrong. And I didn't say complicit back then. I was more like, either I'm part of the solution or I'm part of the problem. And sitting on the sidelines means I'm part of the problem. But looking at what's happened today, I don't want to be complicit in the wrongdoing. I want to be complicit in the good doing. I want to be like John Lewis and get in some good trouble.
Yes, yes, that is amazing. And I feel like Oregonians can be embracing of transplants and newcomers, but also newcomers should also invest and engage in educating themselves on Oregon so that you can get a sense of community by being here. It was once said that the further back you look, the further you can see. So it's one of those things that allows you to look forward. And I appreciate that answer, because it's so important to be able to take a stake in investing in what is going to be a better future for everyone. And since you say that, when you talk about engaging in that kind of dialogue, does discourse, does conversation, does it have impact? Is there fruit that can be desirable from having meaningful dialogue and conversation with individuals within the state of Oregon and beyond?
I do think so. I do think that timing matters, as it does with so many things. I know that I have spent decades having uncomfortable conversations with people about a variety of topics, from race to gender to socioeconomic status, to, quite frankly, in Oregon, people thinking that Oregon is different than the rest of the country and that all the bad stuff around race happened down south. It didn't happen here. And I'm constantly saying, actually, let me tell you about your own history, and interrupting that. But it's also been an opportunity for people over the time to opt out very easily because they were busy or they were distracted, or it was just a polite conversation, but not an invested conversation. I think that we're in an inflection point now with the pandemic, within the pandemic, because COVID-19 happened, and then we had everything come to a fever point with what happened with Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and Tony McDade, and it continues until Mr. Blake, Jacob Blake, that's happening. People could not look away, and all of a sudden it was in their space continuously. So there wasn't an opportunity to not see and feel. And I think people were already having their own challenges with dealing with everything. And now we've got to deal with what could possibly happen if our country changes, with the voter protection and elections and all of that that's going on. So there's a lot people are having to grapple with, not just personally, but also in broader context. And so I think the need for dialogue has heightened in some ways, as well as the need for us to see the humanity in each other and just really figure out how we can get to a better place, because so many people thought we weren't where we are. Yeah. They thought we were beyond this. It had been solved. It was over. And then there were another group of people who were like, it never went away. And then it was another group, but now everybody's having this conversation, and where do we go? And I think that everything happens for a reason. We may not always understand that, but it happens for a reason. And what we do with it determines if we have to repeat it.
Yes. That's amazing. And when you describe that, one of the things that has been maybe surprising for me is the number of people who genuinely have expressed that they were just not aware. I find that almost shocking that before some of these things that have occurred around us, that there were individuals who were walking around who just did not have an awareness of the challenges that were happening in regards to racial equity and social justice and all of those things. So, Adrienne, how do we create a collective awareness so that we don't find ourselves in a situation again where people can actually say, I didn't know, or I wasn't aware, and now they're deciding to educate themselves? Because I find that shocking, surprising. How do we create a collective awareness so that we're all, you mentioned humanity, so that we're all together and that we're all moving forward in an aware position?
Well, I think we have to hold each other accountable. So, when people say, well, I just didn't know, I got it. Nobody's trying to make you feel bad for knowing it. But now that you know, do better. There is an expectation. So I want you to tell me what you're going to do in your way to try and make sure that we don't be what we were. How are we going to be better? I listened to Michelle Obama's podcast, and she had Michelle Martin on, who I just adore. She's incredible. And when she said that she's hoping that what happens out of the COVID-19 pandemic is that we don't go back to normal, that we go to better. That's what I want people to understand. And you have a responsibility for making it better. Beyond holding yourself accountable, you also need to accept responsibility for the world in which you live. I felt like a lot of people felt like it was somebody else's job but theirs to be responsible. And with so many people taking to the streets to protest, I have not been one of them because of the role I take, and I understand that. But a lot of people are saying, not in my lifetime. And what are we going to do? And so I think once you hold yourself accountable and then you start participating, you also have to be open to other people's experiences, their lived experiences, and not try to make them their own. You don't need to validate them. They exist. And people need to get out of that comfort zone, because a lot of people have said, I just didn't see it because it wasn't their experience. Therefore, it didn't have validity. That isn't true. You don't have to walk in everyone's shoes to understand that there are disparities in this country, disparities in this world, injustices that happen for you to have a personal experience to validate that they happen. So what are we going to do to make sure that our country works for the most, not a select few? And then constantly work to it, because it's going to take a very long time. So this is not a short, quick fix. It's not going to be done in 30 days, 6 months, a year, 3 years, 10 years. This has been going on for 401 years and counting. So we're going to have to work on this for a very long time. And there are going to be hits and misses, but you keep focusing. That's what I think happens.
That is so beautiful and well said. Absolutely. It is going to take endurance. As a matter of fact, there's no real way to describe it, but endurance, effort. And then when it gets hard, you can't quit because it will get hard. It will be difficult. So you talked about listening to Miss Obama's podcast, and I would have to imagine that as a judge, you have an exceptional ability to listen and to hear what people are saying. So what types of things are you listening for? When you're listening, what kind of things do you want to hear people say that give you hope and affirmation that we're on the right track?
I'm always listening for that individual's voice. You can, in the years that I've been on the bench, and even before, because I was a litigator before I went on the bench, I had to assess credibility all the time. My clients, other witnesses, counsel, experts. And so I would listen intently for that individual voice. And I could tell from the inflection points if they were connected, disconnected, if they were nervous, whatever. But also I watched their body language, because that told me the level of investment that people have. And I would then translate that to my personal life. My friends like me because, you can choose your friend circle. My family, because I was born into a family, they sometimes like, I really need you to turn that off, okay? Because I'm really good at it. So I can tell if they really want something, if they don't, or they just saying it, whatever. But that lets me know how much I invest. And so that means if I can be vulnerable with you, we can have a really deep connection and listen and learn from each other. If this is just something that passed the day and that's something I don't need to invest with, I'm okay with that. But I know what to do. So I'm looking for people that are listening deeply, that I can connect with to do that hard work, because I know it takes a long time. And I also know that sometimes we're going to have to start over, because I had to start over with some of my colleagues. We've started over a number of times because the clarity of my communication can be off-putting to people. It's nice. I have a very nice, quiet, soft voice sometimes, but the directness of my questions throws people off, and they're like, what is this? I don't know if I want to do that. Well, we don't have to do that. That's okay. But it doesn't mean that I'm not going to ask that question of you and some other people, because what I'm trying to do is find my group to get some work done, because I want to get some work done. And so for me, it's about those tools. So it's listening, trying to see the connection, and also pulling back and accepting where people are. Because too often we're trying to fit people into certain boxes or continuums. And it's not about that. It's about really developing that relationship, and it's a give and take. And it takes time. It's some people you have an instant connection with, others, it's a lot of hard work. I've learned that through my mentorship. There's some people that I mentor, we connect almost immediately. And then there's others, it takes me a year or more to develop that deep connection. But once it's there, it never leaves.
Oh, that's amazing. When you talk about developing connections and the work that it takes to build those, I can't help but to think that you are such a giving person, and so authentic. And at times you've allowed yourself to be vulnerable. And I think that comes from a self-reassurance. But is there a difficulty for leaders, for individuals who have influence, to be vulnerable? Because that seems to be an essential component to actually moving equity forward. Because if you can't be vulnerable and you can't be authentic as a leader, how can you ever hope to actually change the narrative? So is there a difficulty in being in such an influential position as a leader to then also be vulnerable at the same time? And are there measures that you have to consider in doing that?
The answer is yes. So I can be vulnerable to a point, and then it becomes sometimes difficult for me to be able to pull it back and then do my regular job, my day-to-day job. So I have to modulate that. I can do it in large groups, and sometimes I can do it in small groups. But if it's gotten to a point where I can't do it at all, I also talk about that. Because I've been doing this for a long time, and I've gotten really comfortable with being Adrienne and kind of doing that self-work of knowing who Adrienne is. Adrienne goes to everything. Adrienne brings her whole self. So Adrienne's the same at a social setting that she is at work. I have a different role when I'm on the bench. But I use my hands a lot. I'm a person who is demonstrative. And I think I still smile at people. I think they shot pictures of me on the bench where I'm smiling, at least at the trial court. Not so much in the appellate court, but I think so. But I also know when and where I can be vulnerable. So I've had certain things happen over my judicial career where I felt I couldn't speak. There are other times where I felt like even though I didn't feel comfortable speaking, I had to speak because the issue was so important. And even though it was at a personal risk for me, it wasn't always about me because I stand on the shoulders of others. And I can go back because I have a support system to shore myself up. And then there were other times when I could say, I am not able to have a conversation with you because I don't feel safe in this situation with you because you have not been showing up the way I've needed you to. And therefore I don't engage with you in this way. We can do other stuff, but we're not going to do this stuff. And out of that last situation, I've had people come back to me and say, can we talk about that? I thought about that. No one's ever really talked to me about this. And my response is yes, but it's going to be measured because I'm also a human being. And you know what? I just don't wipe the slate clean. You know, I will get there, but we got to rebuild and it takes time. But those relationships are valuable and necessary. I talked about that to my staff. I've talked in large groups about that because I think that the only way we're really going to make the systematic changes that we have to in this country is by having those real conversations. And those real conversations include people saying stuff that you know you disagree with, but that doesn't mean they don't get to hold those conversations. I mean, currently we're having conversations around protests in our court system. So people are wanting to know, can they protest? Can they not? Are they restricted? What are the restrictions? Why are there restrictions? You know, we're talking about self-care and resiliency. We're talking about how to have uncomfortable conversations because whatever is happening in the community where we serve, the end stop is often the courts. And so we have to learn how to address all of this. And most people have not clue one where to start. So they look at people who are willing to have those conversations. And you can't really do that without being vulnerable. But you also have to let people know their boundaries. So I've started conversations with people with ground rules and getting buy-in for ground rules. When we did the listening sessions, I had ground rules that that entire auditorium agreed to. And when I had someone say, I decided I don't want to do the ground rules anymore, I said, well, you don't get to do that because collectively we decided that and you got to follow the rules. And I'm going to cut your mic off like we agreed to if you talk too long. And when the person said, no, you're not, I said, yes, I am. And I did. We ended up having a wonderful conversation. The person ended up moving toward the front and having a beautiful interaction with me throughout the remaining of the session and now supports me in everything I do. But it was not about the topic. It was about us being open to having that interaction and then connecting for a common goal, which was talking about what was going on in the legal system.
That is amazing. It is my hope that the leaders that are listening to you describe that discourse and that engagement can take from you some examples of how they can be better leaders within their organizations by using a vulnerability and also accountability, and then also using those parameters to guide the discussions so that you can actually focus on the issue and move things forward. I think it's so incredibly important that you describe that.
But let me add one more thing to that, because in preparation for the listening session, I had a lot of investment, personal investment in it. I had conceived it. I had reached out, done a lot of the outreach. You know, I was trying to get my colleagues in the judiciary to show up. So I was trying to manage a whole lot of things at one time. And I wanted it to be a success, because if it was not successful, we wouldn't continue to have conversations. And it could be pointed at, see, this is why you don't become vulnerable. This is exactly why you don't do it. So I had a moment over a weekend that I was really kind of caught up. So I called a good friend who has a lot of experience and said, hey, do you have a moment? And she said yes. And we talked, and I kind of went through everything I was feeling. She's an incredible human being, such a gifted person. That's why she does all this international work. And she listened. And at the end of it all, she said, and so what are you supposed to do with this? And I said, I'm supposed to release it. So whatever I'm building will become what it is supposed to be. And I'm not supposed to restrict it by trying to make it what I want it to be. And she said, absolutely. And I believe that self-work and that prep work to bring everyone together, and then that releasing created the beauty of that connection of those listening sessions that have continued in Multnomah County in different forms that we're now getting ready to institute statewide. But it was a really strong lesson and reminder to myself about how you have to take yourself out of it to really reach your goal.
Thank you for sharing that, because I think about that, and I think about that example, Adrienne, on how technology is influencing the ability to have that level of connection and dialogue, and to be able to have kind of your circle of influence of individuals that you can count on, to be able to leverage their wisdom and understanding. And I just want to make sure that as we continue forward as a society, as a community, that technology doesn't get in the way of those relationships, that we can actually continue to build them. Any thoughts on kind of what you've experienced as a listener, as a leader, and how we're in our world today, we seem so disconnected. So we're working toward building those new relationships, but there are so many darts that are being fired at all of us that are divisive. So how do we deal with divisive rhetoric and divisive actions and technology in the middle, and still build meaningful relationships with others?
Wow, that's a great question. And you know what? I don't know if I have a good answer, because I'm going through all of that myself. I mean, I didn't realize what Zoom fatigue was until I got up in the middle of a meeting with my colleagues and just walked away. And they were like, where's Adrienne? And I'm like, oh, Adrienne checked out. Because Adrienne just didn't. Adrienne's body decided she was done, even though her mind was still trying to participate. So it's really difficult. And not only is it difficult, in this current digital world we're living in, which is necessary, which is allowing us to do our day-to-day business, which is very good, and also challenging because we're learning it, and it just kind of was thrust upon us unexpectedly and in such a incredibly short time frame. But then we also have to deal with our emotions around that, dealing with our lives, particularly if you had people you were caring for and being distanced, and people having health issues, and then the disparities around race happening within the health care industry. And then we have everything happen in terms of system injustices. It's a lot to take in, and then to hear those different voices. So what I've had to do is check out, just turn some of that stuff off. I acknowledge that they're all there, but it doesn't mean that I have to invest in them. For example, I have not watched the George Floyd video. I cannot. I remember Rodney King. I remember Eric Gardner. I remember other names of people, Sandra Bland, all kinds of things. I don't need to see that video to know what it means, but it can trigger me into a place that is dark and difficult to come from. So I don't need to do that, because I have to practice self-care and resiliency for myself as a Black woman in this country. Not just someone who works in the legal system, but at the core, being a Black woman who has a child, who has loved ones, who has to navigate all of that. So often I will check out from media because I'm quite aware and I want to be informed, but I can't do the overload. And I encourage other people to do that. I have begun to do a lot of connection with nature. I sit outside, I do walks. They're not long. I have never been an athlete, No, sorry, Orlando, that's not my thing. But I know I need to be connected. And being just seeing people digitally wasn't enough for me. I was feeling the need, just like when I was walking. Everyone who were walking their dogs, the poor dogs, were so upset. They didn't care who you were as long as you weren't from their home. They wanted to be near you. And I was like, you know what? I think I feel the same way in some ways, but it's not safe. So I learned how to do the balance for myself and not based on other people. I think we felt a lot of pressure to do what everybody else was doing. Everything is on a continuum. So one day you might be able to opt into a lot more than other days you can't. And it's okay to just take a day off. You have to give yourself permission to feel all of it, because what I think we have to do is feel it and address it so that we can heal from it, grow stronger from it, and then build.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. You talked about being a Black woman and also in the judicial system. Judge Nelson, you don't experience bias, do you? You don't still have to deal with that sort of thing. I mean, you're a Supreme Court justice. How is it that in this day and time that you actually have to deal with that sort of thing still today?
Every day. It's a new day every day. I mean, I tell people all the time, in the courthouse, I have a lot of privilege. You know, part of the reason why I had a lot of privilege is because they realized that some people may have thought that I was out of place. They made sure I got introduced to everybody in the building so they knew I belonged there, so they wouldn't do anything to offend me. But outside of the court, I'm just like everybody else. Sometimes people recognize me and I get a lot of attention. It's positive. Other times, not so much. And even in the courthouse, yes, I have had people stop me and question why I'm there, both in Multnomah County and at the Supreme Court, who had no authority. Well, I hope I'm opening the door for you and you not supposed, you in here where you're supposed to be. I have no response to that, because you know what? I don't need to justify where I'm going. Clearly, I have a badge that's clicking me into secure places, so I really don't need to have a conversation with you. But yes, it happens all the time. And how do I balance that? I mean, you just know that it's part of my experience. And that's when I say to my friends who are of the dominant culture, there's a way of living that I have to live and had to prepare my daughter for that you never have to consider. And it takes energy and it takes space away from me. But it's also part of what I have to do to live. So I accept it and I learn how to navigate it. And then when I have those conversations with people, then they want to have a different conversation with me because they don't know. And so, because they haven't experienced it. But I also can walk into a space with my other colleagues and I'm the one that everybody knows. And they've decided that I'm the star. And I've said, I'm not the star. It's just because I've been active. You do understand that. So I get it all. And I honestly never know what it's going to be, particularly if I'm out in the world living. I mean, I can kind of guarantee some scenarios when I'm working in my building, but outside, I'm just like everybody else.
With that said, and that's profound, Adrienne, to think that is something that, and I hope those who are listening who may not be aware and are still in that process of awakening can take your words and they can have impact so that they understand that even through the excellence and all of the contributions and all of that you give of yourself, that you still have to be so mindful of that, still shows and demonstrates that we have a long way to go. There is so much pain right now, so much difficulty that's happening. From your perspective, how do we deal with all of the difficult things, hold people accountable, but still move forward simultaneously? How do we address the wrong, but still do the right to move us forward? Do you have thoughts and maybe some suggestions in that?
I think there has to be a whole history telling of the whole experience. I often think about what the Oregon Historical Society has been doing in the last several years. They've partnered with the Oregon Black pioneers in particular to do Racing to Change, to talk about the Black experience during the civil rights movement in Oregon, which was an incredible uh, um, exhibit that I know that they're going to be moving into, making it more of one that's digital that can go around the Oregon Black pioneers. But with their most recent permanent exhibit, Experience Oregon, they went through a lot of history and recognition of bringing other voices into the history of this state, because we do know that how the history of this state was started so that it would be a white utopia, but they wanted more non-white voices included. And it's an incredible story that's accurate, and that people need to see it. And I think people have to expand and view history in a different way, see different lenses, to be curious about the information and question its validity, and see if there are other ways of looking at things. I think people need to do that self-education. And then once they get beyond the emotional component, because there will be an emotional component, then they move into action that is going to be long-term. Because as I think about the different protests over long periods of time, we acknowledge the 100th anniversary of the women's suffrage movement this week, and throughout this month. That was a sustained movement over a very long period of time that had challenges, because every woman's voice was not included. The civil rights movement had a long-standing period of protests. When you think about the sanitation workers' protests in Alabama, that lasted for over a year. And people didn't walk the whole time. They had an organized effort. So when people I hear people saying, when are these protests go in? I'm thinking, they can go for a very, very long time. And you're going to see the same things happening with this movement and other movements. Everything didn't happen as designed. There are always splinter groups, just like what's happening now. But what you have to do is stay focused on the message, which is racial injustice for the protest, and get all of the entities together to move toward change, like what Reimagine Oregon is doing and what the governor is doing with her Racial Justice Council, where we're going to then really look at how our systems are working, how our businesses are working. The Portland Business Journal has been doing many, many, many articles, announcing the disparities in the data, talking about what you can do. So there's lots of information, what you can do beyond the statements. Now, the statements are a first step, but the statement is all that you do not do. Just like understanding that you acknowledge it, you got to then look around. If your workplace is homogenous, you got work to do. If you are on a board and it's homogenous, you have work to do. If they're the same type of people that get promoted up and you got work to do. Figure out what your work is. Don't do everything at once. Prioritize and check them off as you get it done. Because we will be better for it, not worse. Because we all know that when you have that richness of experience and voices and cultures together, it just makes this country what it's supposed to be. We said we're a melting pot. Let's really do it. Let's be that.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. And I love the way that you described how organizations can facilitate the work and treat it foundationally like the other work that they've done. It's the same thing. You take on an initiative, you scope it out, you focus on what your goal is, and you start taking steps to get there. There's no magic bullet. There's no magic serum that's automatically going to just overnight turn an organization to an equitable and inclusive place. You're going to have to do the work, and you're going to take those steps. You mentioned the protest, and earlier in our conversation, you mentioned that a lot of maybe unrest and difficulties and things that happen that are protested end up in the courtroom. They end up in the judicial system. How do you weave equity into the judicial system from your perspective? I think there's probably a lot of people that want to know how your perspective and worldview influences how you interpret, see the law, engage with the law in the judicial system.
Well, it's interesting because when I was a trial judge, I ended up having a jury trial about May Day protests. And it was very interesting. And so the person was convicted and they appealed it, and one of my rulings got reversed. And I figured it would because the law was changing. I ruled as I felt I was supposed to with the current state of the law at the time, but I understood that there was some movement happening. But the wonderful thing that happened for me during that process was that the defendant wrote me. They took the time to write me a personal note to say how well I treated them and how I gave them hope, even though the result was not what they wanted. And they were grateful to have someone like me sitting in the role that I was serving. And I took that into my personal space, my special space, because every time I took the bench, every time I continue to take the bench, I want people to see my humanity. I know what I was trained to do. I apply the same principles and precedents that everyone else does. But there is something to be said about having diversity among judges who are representing the community in which they serve. We can have those nuanced conversations because we are neutral, but we can also say about our different perspectives. So the fact that I am a Black woman who grew up in the Deep South has a role to play. The fact that I grew up in a rural community has a role to play. The fact that I believe in the brightness of our country has a role to play. But it all comes together. The fact that I'm a woman has a role to play. It just depends. It switches all the time. But what I'm willing to do is engage with it and talk about it. You know, the fact that I'm a trial judge is a really big deal right now on the Supreme Court because I'm the only trial judge there. Yeah. So I can say, okay, you're reading a cold record, but let me tell you what it's like in there. I know what happened. I can tell from even the sounds that aren't there, that silence in the record. And I watch body language, you know, so we recently had a case and I supplemented the record by saying the record needed to reflect that this person's body language was communicating something to us that the words weren't. So I try to help everybody have as much information as they can. I mean, I'm one of the few judges in this state that has actually served as a juror. I answered my jury summons as I should as a private citizen, and I got chosen. And I sat on a 5-day jury. The one part that judges and lawyers never know is that private jury deliberation. Because when that door closes, we don't get to really know what's going on. I've even had that experience. So I feel like I bring a lot. And I lay it there, and I'm willing to go as far as I need to go with it. And if you don't want to believe it, that's fine, because I realize I don't need to I don't need to get everyone to agree with me. I need you to hear me and consider enough parts of what I'm saying so that we can come to a resolution that everyone can live with. And if I can get other people to move to my side because I'm trying to be persuasive, that's what I'm trying to do. I do know how to do simple math. I just need 4 out of 7. That's all. I don't have to have 7 out of 7.
Awesome, awesome. I want to ask you, Adrienne, what is your, now you have a unique perspective on Oregon. You've got a vantage point, you've had experiences, you came from Arkansas to Oregon, lots of perspectives that you have that maybe traditional Oregonians don't have. What is your hope? What for Oregon in the future? What is it that you hope comes out of all of the things that are happening, whether from the pandemic through the protests, through all of the things that are happening to Oregon being called one of the whitest cities by the New York Times? What do you hope for this state?
I really hope that Oregon really thinks about where it takes its next step. You know, the Reimagine Oregon is something I'm so proud of, the various leaders in the Black community coming together to work with the various electeds to come with a shared vision on moving forward. So I would like for the Oregonians to embrace that model and to support it and understand that it's going to cause other conversations, not just around race, but also around gender, around socioeconomic, around disabilities, able-bodiedness, around religion, and that none of us can be free until all of us are free and able to live our lives. And it does mean that equity is going to be a component where some people are going to have to give up some of the stuff that they've had so that others may have it. But it's all for the common good. You know, I truly believe that we sometimes are our biggest barriers to living our best lives. And I really want Oregon to be like what Michelle Martin said. I don't want us to go back to normal. I want us to do better. I want us to be better. You know, a dream of mine, quite frankly, is for us to have a reconciliation commission where we can really talk about it. Because if we can do this in Oregon, we can do this anywhere with the history of this state and the demographics. And I believe Oregon can make it happen.
Absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. I agree. Reconciliation Commission. We're going to have to coin that and make that happen, because
I'll make it a better term. I don't know. That's just kind of my words for today.
Well, they were perfect and poignant. So, Adrienne, you, for your work in this state, are phenomenal. We are so fortunate and blessed to have you serving on the Oregon Supreme Court. We thank you for all of your service, all of your board work, all of your commitment to making Oregon a better place for all of its constituents. It is amazing, and I am honored that you accepted my invitation to talk, and I cannot wait until we can have dinner again safely. I look forward to that. So thank you for being so gracious with your time.
Thank you. And I hope everyone takes good care.
Thank you very much. We'll see you all next time on Community Conversations.